Hello class, so in this video we're going to talk about a really important concept that's really going to evolve your poker game, and that is range-based thinking. So for those of you that have been playing poker for quite some time, you already know what range-based thinking is, but for those of you that are just moving up the ranks and you are playing very good ABC poker, but you want to evolve your game, if you're not thinking about your opponent's hands and your hands in terms of ranges, well, this is really going to help you improve your game. So what are ranges and what is range-based thinking? So ranges are the set of all possible hands that our opponents can potentially have in any given hand. And range-based thinking is always thinking about both our hands and our opponent's hands in any given situation as a range of hands, so a group of hands instead of an individual hand. So instead of thinking, I think my opponent has ace-king suited here, or I think my opponent has a set of jacks, think about a group of hands that your opponent can have. Instead say, I think my opponent has a range that looks like this. Ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, etc. And the whole point behind range-based thinking is that it's a lot easier and a lot more realistic to try to put your opponents on a range of hands instead of one single hand. It's really unrealistic to try to put your opponent on one single hand. And if we think about poker outside of a vacuum, if we think about all these different situations in the long run, our opponents are never always going to have the same hand. They're going to have a subset of hands that they're going to make different moves with. So they're going to have a range of hands that they're going to make different moves in the same situations over and over again. So that's why we do range-based thinking. Now, one thing I want you to remember to do whenever you're playing a hand is always ask, what's my opponent's range? So that's why I put that on the slide here. What's his range? Always think about, well, what's his range? What could he be doing this with? What type of a range makes sense in this situation? And when we're talking about range-based thinking, one thing you want to think about is the funnel concept. So I don't know if other poker coaches are using this concept, but it's something that I think fits very nicely with thinking about ranges. So think about a funnel. It's just a basic funnel. If you went to an auto parts store or if you went to a home improvement store and you bought a funnel, it's wide at the top and it's narrow at the bottom. And that aligns really well with thinking about our opponent's ranges, because our opponent's ranges are always widest at the beginning of the hand, and as we go all the way down from the flop, the turn, and the river, their ranges of hands get narrower and narrower until the end of the hand, based upon the board texture, the action of the hand, and what we know about them. So they're always going to start with a really wide range of hands, but let's say, for example, our opponent raises middle position, and let's say we put him on something like a 15% range of hands, like the top 15% range of hands. When it gets to the flop, let's say maybe there's a king, jack, deuce on the flop. Well, only a certain subset of those ranges of hands is he going to fire a continuation bet. So if he fires a continuation bet, all the different hands where we think that he would not fire a continuation bet, we can remove that from his range. And then on the turn, if another card hits, then we have to think about how does that affect his range, how does that affect his betting, and what fits the best into there. And so that's the funnel concept. Ranges are already really wide up here always for our opponents, but by the time we get down to the river, ranges are going to become very, very small. So always think about the funnel concept when you're trying to put your opponents on ranges. So now let's talk about the different criteria that we think about when we're trying to define ranges for our opponents. What are we looking at? What's going to help us better define what our opponents potentially have? Well, we're going to try to use as much information as we have available to us to make those decisions. And I've highlighted some of the important ones. So number one, we're going to look at our opponent's playing styles and tendencies. Is our opponent a good opponent? Is our opponent a bad opponent? Is our opponent tight aggressive? Is he loose passive? Is he a maniac? Is he a very nitty? Is he the Scrooge of poker? Right? We need to think about their playing style and what type of ranges are going to fit within that playing style. We also need to look at our notes if we have notes on our opponents. So if you're playing online, look at the notes that you've taken. If you're playing live, take a look at Your mental notes, well, you can't really take a look, but think about your mental notes that you have on your opponents, on what they've been playing with and what type of hands they've done certain types of things with throughout the session. What hands have they limped with? What hands have they raised? What hands have they check raised with? And so forth. Get an idea of how they play and what the notes are and how that's going to affect their ranges. If you play online, definitely utilize your HUD stats. This is probably going to be one of the most important tools in your arsenal when you're looking at your opponent's ranges, because your HUD stats breaks everything down into a statistical analysis and it's just right there available for you to use. So you get a good idea of what type of ranges your opponent's going to have just by looking at your HUD stats. And then the last two items, I want to talk about these together. We need to take a look at the pre-flop action, the post-flop action, and the post-flop board texture together. So if you think about it, we need to see what type of actions our opponents take. Are they c-betting relentlessly? Are they check raising? Are they checking and giving up a lot? Are they just flat calling pre-flop? What are they doing pre-flop? What makes sense? And post-flop, what makes sense per the board texture? And I always like to ask what makes sense whenever I'm doing a range analysis, because that's really going to help you pinpoint the type of ranges that your opponents are on. So for example, let's say our opponent is a loose passive opponent and he donks out on the flop. You have to think, what type of hand would my loose passive opponent that's a bad opponent, what would they donk out a half pot size bet on the pot on an ace 9-4 rainbow board texture? What are they most likely to have? A made hand or a bluff? If it's a made hand, well, what type of made hands? And same thing, let's say you're playing against a nit, and a nit check raises you on the turn. You have to think, well, what makes sense? What fits into this player's playing style and this type of action on this board texture? So again, it gets down to that funnel concept. We're trying to narrow in on the specific type of hands our opponents could be making these moves with. So always ask what makes sense. One thing that is vitally important to your long-term success when it comes to hand reading and putting your opponents on ranges is understanding that this takes a lot of time. It's taken me a lot of time I'm not even mastered this concept yet, but to be good at this concept of hand reading and understand hand ranges, it takes a lot of time to be good, great, and to master this concept. So don't expect to understand how to do effective hand reading and understanding your opponent's ranges in a matter of days or weeks or months. It may take you half a year, it may even take you a year to become an expert at hand reading. It may take you a couple months depending on how often you play and how often you're studying. So understand that you're going to struggle at first, but over time you're going to start to get it and you're going to become better at it over time. So in the long run, you'll be a good hand reader, but in the beginning, you're probably going to struggle like most people. And if you don't, well, that's awesome. I applaud you for that. But personally for me, it's taken me months just to be good at hand reading. So there's lots of concepts you have to understand to be good at this as well. And a lot of it really just comes down from experience as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the framework. I know we've already really kind of dived into this a little bit and talked about it informally, but let's talk about it from a framework perspective. So the first thing you want to do is pre-flop is you want to put your opponent on a defined pre-flop hand range based upon what they're doing pre-flop. So look at their playing style, look at their tendencies, the notes, and define a range that they have. Now, if you're playing live, of course, it's going to be in your head. And even if you're playing online where you have 30 seconds stacked, you're not going to pop up Equilab or PokerStove and try to define a range. It's always going to be in your head. The only time we're going to do a deep analysis is when we are doing a hand history review or we're doing a really deep dive analysis into the hand and our opponent's ranges. So the first thing you want to do is just assign them a range. If we have a tight aggressive opponent that's opening in middle position, we know that they have a fairly tight opening range and we have an idea in our head what they're raising with. If we have a loose passive bad fish limping under the gun, we can assume they're probably limping something like a 40% of hands. So assign them pre-flop ranges. Now what happens if a brand new person sits down at the table, they have a full buy-in stack, you know nothing about them? My recommendation is always assign them a default range of hands based upon how a standard decent player would play, and then adjust them accordingly over time. So based upon how they're playing, then you can tweak them. But always start with the standard range. And that's what I like to do. I like to assign them a standard range of opening ranges, calling ranges, 3-betting ranges, and so forth, based upon how a standard decent player would play. And then as we get reads on them, as we understand how they play, we can tweak those ranges accordingly. So once you've assigned the preflop ranges, the next step is to think about the postflop play and how everything affects that and how it narrows down ranges. So we talk about narrowing it down like a funnel, and that's what we want to do here in this framework. We want to start removing cards from our opponent's ranges based upon each street of action. So look at the flop board texture, look at their playing style, look at their actions, and ask yourself what makes sense. And make an educated guess based upon all the information that you have available, and start narrowing down their range and start focusing on a subset of range of hands that makes the most sense in that situation. So that's a framework. We're not going to do any hands in this lecture. After this lecture, I'm going to go over some hand histories, and we're going to practice this as I go through hands that I've played in the past. So another thing to understand is that you're never going to be 100% correct when you're hand reading against your opponents. Sometimes you're going to be correct, other times you're not going to be correct. And you're not supposed to be correct 100% of the time, because if you were correct 100% of the time, then you're going to be a master at this game and you don't need to be taking this course. I mean, this gets back to the fundamental theorem that David Skolansky developed, where he said if you knew what your opponent's hold cards were, the less mistakes you make, the more money you're going to make. And the more mistakes they make, the more money they're going to lose to you. The problem is, with this fundamental theorem, is we never know our opponent's hold cards. Pre-flop, we never know what's going to happen post-flop. We don't know what our opponents are going to do. We don't know the board texture. We don't know what's going to come on the turn in the river. So it's a game of imperfect information. Yes, we want to strive for perfection, but we should expect to be wrong from time to time. And that's really at the heart and soul of this game. This game is a game of educated guesses and imperfect information. So expect to be wrong sometimes. Don't expect to be right 100% of the time. And if you're doing a range analysis and you got it wrong, don't beat yourself up. So just understand that. Some people are going to say, well, you analyzed, you played wrong in this situation. That's okay. Everybody screws up from time to time in poker. We all make mistakes. The goal is to make less mistakes than our opponents. If we make less mistakes than our opponents, then we make money. And that's the end goal. So, the concept of perceived ranges. So, what is a perceived range? Well, it's just like it says. It's what our opponents perceive us to have and what we perceive our opponents to have. Now, there's an interesting thing about perceived ranges, and it all depends on the stakes that you play at and the level of skill of the opponents that you play at. Don't automatically assume that your opponents wonder what your range is. Lots of times, opponents at the lower levels, the low live stakes like 1-2 and 1-3, no limit hold'em live, or maybe 2-4, 3-6, 4-8 limit live poker, and a lot of the lower micro stakes, 25 and L down to 2 and L, a lot of your opponents aren't thinking, what is his range? What are my opponent's ranges? Or what does my opponent think my range is? They're just looking at their cards and looking at the board texture and they're playing their hand face up. So don't fall into that fallacy of overthinking situations against bad opponents, because you're going to want to generally, as you improve your game, think about, well, what does he think my range is in this opponent, and how is he going to react to my perceived range? Well, if he's a bad player, he's not going to be thinking like that. He's going to be thinking, well, I have a pair of aces on this board texture, he's betting, I'm going to call. And that's the end of their thinking. So against a bad poker player, don't think about perceived ranges and how they perceive your hand to be. Only think about what most likely he has and how he's going to be playing face up. Now, on the flip side, if you're playing against decent opponents and good opponents, then you have to start thinking about the concept of perceived ranges, where you need to ask, well, what does he think I mostly have and what I'm most likely doing in this situation? Because that's where what we like to call the metagame comes into play, where the analysis and the the understanding and guessing of what our opponents potentially could be doing in different situations with different hands and so forth. So against good opponents, think about perceived ranges and how they think your perceived range is likely in a certain situation. But against bad opponents, don't do it because they're not going to think about it. They don't think at that type of level in poker. So what's next? Well, that's going to conclude this PowerPoint lecture. What we're going to do next is I'm going to do some hand history reviews. So what I'm going to do is you're going to see me doing range analysis live in videos. Well, not really live. It's going to be recorded, but you're going to be seeing me doing it in the videos. I'm going to pull some hand histories, and we're going to go through this process. So we're going to use this funnel concept and this framework that we developed, and we're going to put our opponents on ranges, and we'll see how well I did. So if you have any questions about range-based thinking, please let me know. Post your questions in the course discussion box. If you need more information on range-based thinking, let me know too. There's a wealth of information out there on the internet on all sorts of different training sites and poker websites, and I can compile information to help you further understand this concept as well outside of this class. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next video.